think that now we can start the next part of our seminar since Nadia is already with us. I would like to remind you that we have interpretation today. Our interpreters are working with us, and if you want to listen to the interpretation, please select the relevant channel, either English or Ukrainian. And I will start
І я з
recording now.
приємністю представлю нашу наступну доповідачку.
And
Це
now I
пані
would
Надія
like to
Гончаренко.
introduce
Пані Надія
our
старша
next
наукова
speaker, Nadia
співробітниця
Honcharenko.
Інституту
Nadia
культурної
Honcharenko is a
культурології
senior research
Національної
fellow
академії
at the
мистецтв
Institute of
України,
Cultural Research on
учасниця
the National
програми
Academy of Arts
Університету
of
ідеалів для
Ukraine.
українських науковців.
And
Перший когорт
she is
22-23
also a research
років.
fellow at the Indiana
Дослідження пані
University
Надії включають
non-residential
політику
research
пам'яті,
program
історичні наративи
for
впливу
Ukrainian
світової
scholars
трансформацію
for
культурного
the
простору в
first
Україні.
edition.
Зокрема, останні її публікації – це
She is also
«Дзеркала
the editor
пам'яті»,
of series
рецензія на
of
книжку «Бабин Яр», книжка видана
prose
за редакцією
pieces.
Владислава Гриневича
For
та
instance,
Оберзовського
she
Павла
wrote
Гроші в
a
університеті
review
Торонто, а
on
також
the
стаття велика
Baban
в
Yar
австралійському
publication,
журналі
and she also
«Політики
authored an
історії»
article in
2025
Australian
року
journal on
«Трансформація
history
історичних
on
наративів на
the
наративи про
transformation
Другу
of
світову війну»
historic
та
narratives on
«Декомунізація
the Second World War and the
політики
communization of
пам'яті
memory
в
policy
Україні».
in
Прошу, пані
Ukraine.
Надія, вам слово. І
Nadia,
пані
now I would like
Надія
to give the floor to
розповість
you.
про
And
сьогоднішню свою
Nadia
дуже
will
захопливу тему.
tell us more
Дуже
about
дякую. Дякую
your
за представлення,
topic
дякую за
for the day.
запрошення. Я
Thank you
також
very much for
дякую.
introducing me, and
По-перше,
thank
я
you very
хочу
much for
подякувати
having me.
програмі
First and
університету
foremost, I
Індіани
would
за
like
підтримку
to
українських
thank
науковців. Це для
Indiana
нас надзвичайно
University
важливо
for your
в ці тяжкі
support for
часи.
Ukrainian
І не лише тому,
scholars.
що ви підтримуєте
This
кожного з
support is
нас особисто, але ви
essential
також
for us,
створюєте
especially during
середовище для
such difficult
спілкування, яке
times.
для нас є дуже
We are
цінним і
very
дуже корисним для
grateful
всіх нас
for
в різних
creation
сферах
of this
гуманітарних і суспільних, де ми
platform for
працюємо.
Ukrainian
По-друге, я
scholars
хочу
working in
подякувати пану
different
Євгену
domains.
Захарченку, якого
And
я
I would
бачу,
like
бо
also to
він
thank
якимось
Yevgen
чином спровокував
Zakharchenko. I
мене
see
на
he is
і на ці назви,
on
і
the
на
call
цю групу.
today. He
От,
actually inspired me to
я
the
ставила
specific
питання і була в
topic
якихось
for my
речах з ним не
presentation today.
погоджувалася, а ми ж знаємо,
I
як іноді
had some
якісь тези, з
disagreements
якими
with
ми не
him, as
погоджуємося, вони
sometimes
доводять нас
there were statements
пожежу для
that
роздумів,
cause
вони нас
arguments,
закликають
but at the same
розвивати
time,
свої
they give us
аргументи.
food for
І, власне, я
thought.
за це пану Євгену
Therefore, I would like to
вдячна.
thank Yevgen
Отже,
for
назва моєї
inspiring me.
доповіді звучить
The title of
провокативно.
my
Зламати
presentation is a
спільну
provocative
миску і розірвати
one,
древній
destroying the
зв'язки.
common cradle and
Трансформація
breaking
явлень про культурну
fraternal
спадщину
bonds,
в Україні.
transformation of
Усі,
the
хто
notion of cultural heritage in
навчався в
Ukraine.
школах чи в
All those
університетах
who
за
studied at the
СРСР прекрасно
universities
розуміють, що таке
during the
спільнота мозка
Soviet times,
і що таке братні
we
зв'язки.
all
І,
understand
власне,
what the
через те
common
я,
cradle
але
means
тим,
and
хто
what
не так
fraternal
добре
bonds are
ознайомлений
referred
зазвичай з цими
to. But for
концепціями, я
those
це
lucky
розповім
who do not
у
know what
своїй
these concepts
доповіді.
stand for, I
Зараз
will
я
delve into
поділюся
detail a bit
своєю
later.
презентацією
Let me start
невеличкою.
sharing my screen.
Так, чи ви бачите мій
All right.
екран?
Can you
Так,
see my
добре.
presentation? Yes?
Отже, почну з того, що широкомасштабне вторгнення Росії у 2022 році
The large-scale
спричинило
Russian invasion
багато
of
матеріальних і людських
2022
втрат і
caused a
їх
lot of
спричинення.
material and
Воно також
human
спричинилося
losses,
до
and we
катастрофічного
are
руйнування
still
культурної спадщини в Україні.
sustaining these losses. And at the same time,
Причому
it caused
подвійні втрати через те, що це не лише
the
чинник
loss
нашої
in
глибинної
cultural heritage
відсутності,
of
наша культурна
Ukraine.
спадщина,
And
але це дуже
this
також багато
is
свідомо
the dual
розмаїття
loss, as it is
сьогодення.
the
Тобто
loss
це
of
втрати не
the
лише для
cultural
України, а й для
diversity of
європейської
Ukraine,
культури і для
part of
всесвітньої
our
культури.
cultural identity, but also
Уся
this is a
культурна
loss in
спадщина
the
в усіх
cultural
її
diversity
проявах,
of
матеріальних і
humanity.
нематеріальних,
The
є
cultural
важливою для
heritage
формування
in all its
ідентичності.
manifestations,
Через те
both tangible
збереження у
and
публічному
intangible,
просторі
is the basis
об'єктів,
for
які
identity
марковані сенсами
formation.
країни
Therefore,
агресорки,
the
їх
safeguarding
переосмисленням
of
або
the
відмінцюванням
cultural
набуває нової
property in
ролі в цих
public
обставинах і
spaces
стає
marked with the
тепер
means
уже
of
і
the aggressor
чинником
country,
національної
and
безпеки.
their reinterpretation and
Російське імперське
elimination
та
takes
більшовицьке
on a new
колоніальне
role,
освоєння
becoming a
територій і
factor of national
підпорядкування населення
security.
відбувалося завжди не лише військовими діями і
Russians
репресіями,
have been oppressing Ukrainians not only physically but also by means of cultural violence. We saw a lot of colonial markers and we saw a lot of geographic names being changed to the ones that were propagating the Russian historical myths. And these historical myths were always centered around the fraternal peoples, common past and common cradle with Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians. And this was the story with until the reunification with Russia. And at the same time, this cradle and this unity was also based on the dominance of Russia and its exceptional role. Transformation of perception of the cultural heritage in independent Ukraine is a complex task. Over the past decade, a number of papers were published on the transformation of public perception of the past. This problem is widely represented in European and North American scholarship field as historians, sociologists, philosophers, and political scientists, as well as cultural anthropologists, have been developing methodologies for analyzing the relationship between the imperial centers and peripheries. The critical rethinking of one's prejudices and the injustice gave the impetus to study the cultural heritage of colonized people, and it became the source of inspiration for creative, innovative concepts of social development. At the same time, European and American scholars are mostly focusing on analyzing their own colonial practices. And therefore, before the Russian aggression of 2022, the Western scholars were not taking into due consideration the imperial role of Russia and the colonial past of the former USSR. Some some scholars until now prefer to ignore the Soviet colonialism, and they do not agree that it could pertain to the Soviet era. For instance, Maria Malkso says the mainstream post-colonial studies focus on the political construction of the racial hierarchies based on skin color, not among white people themselves. The question of the post-coloniality of former Russian imperial subjects, including post-communist subjects in the former Soviet republics and on the outer edges of the Soviet Empire, remains a complex and controversial one in scholar among academia. And British scholar Jade McGlynn, in her essay Pushkin on Mass Graves, wrote the following. Since February 2022, the Kremlin has increasingly turned to Russian literature and history to soften its image and divert attention from its militaristic and repressive actions. Since the 24th of February, they have focused on great Russian culture, ballet, literature, and composers. Regardless of any debate about how great this culture is, um, it is used as whitewashing and a method to distract attention from the horrific destruction of Ukraine by Russia. We see that there is the pressure of the communist regime, and especially on the was a lot of impact in Ukraine. A number of Ukrainian historical figures and politicians, as well as media representatives, were still supporting the Russian narratives and followed the Russian template templates,
і
even
насичені
after
його маркерами
the
національної
split of
ідентичності.
the Soviet Union.
Одним із найвагоміших чинників
One of the
деконструкції
most
цих
important
колоніальних
factors in
концепцій
the
якраз є
deconstruction of
трансформація
colonial
уявлень про
concepts
культурну
is the
спадщину
transformation of
і
ideas about cultural
застосування
heritage
історико-культурологічного аналізу до
by
процесу
applying
її
historical
створення і
and cultural
функціонування.
analysis to the
Йдеться про
process of its
виокремлення
creation and
елементів
functioning.
спадщини, які є
It
маркерами
means and
російсько-радянської ідеології. Йдеться також про
stressing
обмеження
of
їхнього
the elements
символічного
of
впливу та
heritage,
суспільної
and
значущості,
since
зокрема
they
через
are the
позбавлення їх
markers of
статусу
Russian
пам'яток
and Soviet
національного чи місцевого
ideology.
значення,
And
які
it also
перебувають під
means that
охороною
there is a need
законодавства,
to
а
limit their
відтак
symbolic
законодавчо
impact and social
унормованого усунення
significance,
із публічного
which in its
простору.
turn requires
Донедавна
the
це
legal
небагато
regulation
для того,
for
щоб ми
their
трансформували
removal
свої
from the
уявлення
public
про
space.
об'єкти
Until
культурної спадщини,
recently,
були
one
такі
of the
риси:
most significant
спотворення
obstacles to
знання
the
про
transformation
історію
of the
культури
perception of
України,
the
а також щільність
heritage
насичення українського
sites
простору
was
пам'ятками
the
історії
distorted
радянського
knowledge about the
періоду,
history and
себто
culture of
об'єктами
Ukraine
з яскравим
and
ідеологічним
the
змістом,
density of
які були
saturation
створені
of the
на
Ukrainian
замовлення і
space with
під наглядом
historical
режиму.
monuments of the
Я
Soviet
хочу
period.
нагадати, що суперечки щодо культурної спадщини
I
не
would like
є
to
аж такими
remind you that
сучасними.
the debate
Бо
over
вперше
the
питання
cultural
деколонізації,
legacy
тобто
of the
ліквідації
past
пам'ятників
is
минулої епохи,
not
постало в
a
Україні
new
понад 100 років
thing.
тому.
For the first time, the
Вирішенню
issue
цього
of
питання доручило
decolonization
Міністерство внутрішніх справ
arose
Української
in
Народної
Ukraine more
Республіки.
than
У
100
квітні
years ago.
1918
The
року
decision was entrusted
Міністерство
to the
внутрішніх
Ministry
справ
of
УНР
Internal
винесло на
Affairs of the
розгляд Ради
Ukrainian
міністрів
People's
доповідну
Republic.
записку про
In
ліквідацію
April
пам'ятників самодержавства.
1918,
Там йшлося про
the Ministry
пам'ятники
of
в
Internal
Києві, які були
Affairs submitted
споруджені
a report
російським урядом,
to the
аби
Council of People's
демонструвати
Ministers
поневолення України.
on the
Зокрема, йшлося й
elimination
про
of
написи, які були
monuments
на
to
пам'ятниках, наприклад,
autocracy.
Богдану Хмельницькому,
It
Володимиру
also pertained
царя
to the
Василевслава
inscription on the
Православного
monuments, for
або
instance,
Богдану Хмельницькому
monuments to
відділення
Bogdan
Євгенії
Khmelnytsky.
Русі.
We prefer the
Міністерство тоді
Eastern
запропонувало
Orthodox Tsar
знести
and to
пам'ятники
Bogdan
Олександру
Khmelnytsky,
II,
one
Іскрі та
indivisible
Кочубею і
Russia.
рештки пам'ятника Столипіну, а
The
пам'ятник
ministry
Миколі
proposed to
І
remove the
Львів
monuments to Alexander
університету.
II,
Написи на
Iskra, and
пам'ятнику
Kochubey,
Хмельницькому замінити іншими,
and some
двоголових
of the
орлів, які не
inscriptions
становлять
were
собою
suggested
складової
to
органічної
be
частини орнаменту
replaced.
польської
For
нації.
instance,
Для цього
double-headed
пропонувало створити
eagles
комісію з
were
представників
proposed
міністерства,
to be
істориків,
removed,
архітекторів,
and
мистецтвознавців, аби вони опрацювали всі пам'ятники не лише в Києві, а й
it
скрізь в
also
Україні. На
required
жаль,
a lot
тоді
of
до цього
work
не
on the part
дійшло
of
через
historians,
більшовицьку окупацію
architects, and
України.
art historians.
Натомість
But
більшовики втілювали
unfortunately,
в Україні
these
ленінський
efforts were
план
never put to
монументальної
practice
пропаганди,
due to
який був
the
прийнятий
Bolsheviks'
декретом
invasion
РНК
in Ukraine.
РСФСР під назвою «Про зняття пам'ятників, споруджених
Instead,
на
the
честь
Bolsheviks
царів
in
і їх
Ukraine
заслуг і
implemented
вироблених
Lenin's
проєктів
plan for
пам'ятників російської
monumental
соціалістичної
propaganda.
революції». Теж, до речі, прийнятий у
And
квітні 1918
there
року.
was
Для чого
the
прийнятий? Цитую.
special
Щоб
regulation
ознаменувати
passed on
велику
the
дню
removal of
російської
monuments erected
соціалістичної
in honor
революції,
of czars
встановити
and
радянські
their
пам'ятники,
servants, and the
змінити назви
development of
вулиць,
projects
емблем,
for
гербів
monuments to
новими,
the Russian
які відображають
Socialist
ідеї
Revolution.
відбуття революційної
In
трудової
order to
Росії.
mark the great
Кінець
days of the
цитати.
Russian
Тобто
Socialist
імперська Росія на
Revolution,
теренах
erect Soviet
України
monuments,
витіснила
replace
Росія
street names,
більшовицька, що почала
emblems,
активно
coats of
створювати і
arms
втілювати
with the new
міфологеми
ones
про
that
дружбу
reflect
народів.
the ideas and
Цей
feelings of the
процес
revolutionary
насичення
class
українського
Russia. It
простору
means
комуністичною
that this
пропагандою у статті
myth
«Індустрія
about the
минулого»
friendship
констатував
of peoples has
мистецтвознавець
been
Годін.
coined
Стаття
back then. According
1971
to art
року.
historian
Цитата.
Fogel,
Кожне найменше село,
every
кожне
smallest
селище
village
хоче свій
and
пам'ятник
town
Леніну.
wants
Як же
its own
задовольнити цей
monument to
величезний
Lenin.
попит?
How
На
can we meet
українські
this
мапи
huge
встановлюються
demand?
сотні монументів.
Hundreds
Ось
of
чому
monuments
можемо
are
говорити про
erected in
індустрію
Ukraine
монументів,
every
не
year.
боячись тієї
That is why we can
юридичної
talk about the
скрутки. Бо
monument
справді
industry
існує ця
without
індустрія.
even
У
fearing
Києві, у Львові, у
the
Харкові,
usage of
Одесі,
this term.
Донецьку та в інших
It
містах
actually
працюють комбінати
exists, this
художнього фонду
industry,
УРСР,
in Lviv,
оснащені
Kiev,
спеціальним
Kharkiv,
обладнанням
Odessa,
зі
and
штатом
Donetsk, and other
архітекторів,
cities.
інженерів,
There are
техніки,
plans
робітників тощо.
of the art
А
fund of the Ukrainian
у 1972
Socialist Soviet
році заступник
Republic that are
голови
equipped with
адміністрів
special
України
equipments
Тронько
and with a
звітував.
staff of
За
architects,
5 років
engineers,
Товариство охорони
technicians,
пам'яток
and
виділило на
workers
спорудження пам'ятників
that are
та
working
створення
on
музеїв 10
monuments.
мільйонів карбованців.
10
У тому числі на
million
пам'ятники Леніну і пам'ятник
карбованці
знаки
were
революційної і бойової слави
allocated
радянського народу 4,3 мільйони карбованців.
in the past
Отже, на
5 years,
1977 рік
as it was known
Українка
in
мала 1000 монументів
1972.
діячам
And
Компартії
that
і
amount was allocated
революційної
for the
російсько-більшовицького
to the
перевороту
monuments and
17-го
creation
року,
of
учасникам російської
museums.
війни проти Української Народної Республіки,
And
яка
most of
називалася громадянською
this
історіографією, і
amount
героям
was
Великої
dedicated
Вітчизняної
to
війни,
the monuments
себто
to Lenin and
воєнізованої
monuments
версії
and
Другої
memorials
світової
to the
війни.
revolutionary
І
command
всі
and
вони були
labor
включені в
glory of the
офіційну
Soviet
охоронювану
people.
державою історико-культурну спадщину України.
These
Загалом
monuments
на
were included into
1977 рік
the
нараховувалося
protected cultural
47 тисяч
heritage of
пам'яток, з
Ukraine.
них
As of
27 тисяч Збройним силам
1977,
Великої
there were over
Вітчизняної війни, 3 тисячі пам'ятників
40,000
Леніна,
monuments in
1 тисяча
Ukraine,
діяча комуністичної
including
партії,
almost
революції та
27,000
громадянської
monuments
війни.
to heroes
Отже,
and events of
радянські
the Great
пам'ятники, ми
Patriotic
бачимо,
War,
складали понад
and
2
about
третини
1,000
загального
monuments
масиву.
to
Якщо
Lenin.
судити за цими монументальними місцями пам'яті, навіть не беручи топоніми,
Judging
то
by
Україна майже не мала
these
нерадянської
landmarks,
історії.
Ukraine basically
Що
didn't
почалося
have
після відновлення
non-Soviet
незалежності України, а
history.
точніше навіть
What
напередодні
happened after
цього
Ukraine gained
відновлення?
its independence and even a
Відбувалася
bit earlier?
декомунізація, яка почалася ще
Decommunization
напередодні
took
розпаду
place,
СРСР
and
під час
actually it
демократизації в кінці
started even
80-х
before the
років.
split of the
Отже,
Soviet
напередодні
Union,
розпаду
and
СРСР
it was
в Західній
inspired by
Україні місцеві
democratization
демократично
of
обрані ради
the
міняли топоніми і зносили
1980s.
Леніна.
And
На
the
другому
monuments
етапі в
to Lenin were
91-92 роках теж відбувалися
removed
ті самі
and
процеси,
the
але
geographic
здебільшого це
names were
теж було в
changed.
Західній Україні
After
і
the
в Києві.
independence of
Після
Ukraine,
помаранчевої
and the
революції
biggest efforts
була
were
певна
mostly
хвиля
concentrated in the
декомунізації,
western part of
доволі
Ukraine.
делікатна,
After the Orange
проти пам'ятників
Revolution,
Леніну
another
та
wave
проти
of decommunization, but
на
that wave
знесення
was
пам'ятників
a mild
організаторам
one.
Голодомору. До речі, ось цей
Especially,
пам'ятник Осіору в Києві,
these
який є на
efforts
першому
were
слайді, він і був якраз
pertaining to
демонтований
the
попри
demolition
спротив
of
комуністичної партії
monuments to
під
those
час цієї
who
хвилі
contributed to
знесення
Holodomor.
монументів організаторам Голодомору. Ленінопад, тобто протестне знесення пам'ятників Леніну
The
взимку
takedown of
2013-2014 року було
Lenin
рисою
monuments
громадянського руху.
was part
Частина
of the
Революції
civic
Гідності через те,
movement
що ці
of
пам'ятники сприймалися вже не як релікти
2013-2014,
СРСР,
and it was
а
part of
як
the
символи
revolution of
режиму
dignity,
Януковича і
since
Русського
these
І, власне,
monuments
тут ми
were
вже
perceived
бачимо зміну
not as the
уявлень.
monuments
Тобто
pertaining
Ленін
to the
перестав
Soviet era, they were
символізувати
viewed
велику жовтневу
as a part
соціалістичну
of
революцію і
Yanukovych's
радянський лад,
regime.
а перестав більшою мірою символом сучасної
And we
Росії.
see that the connotation
Найширша
changed.
кампанія
These
демонтажу
monuments
монументів
became
перейменувань
the symbol of the modern
розпочалася після
Russia.
прийняття у квітні 2015 року
After
законів про
the
декомунізацію.
adoption of the laws on
І,
decommunization
зрештою,
in
продовжилася вже
2015,
після повномасштабного
the
вторгнення.
decommunization
Отже,
gained
уявлення про
momentum,
цінність
and
пам'ятників
these
Леніну
efforts
та іншим
were
дієвцям
continued at a higher
комуністичної
pace
режиму
after
як
the
елементів
full-scale
спадщини,
invasion
що
of
варті збереження,
2022.
трансформувалося саме внаслідок певних
We
суспільно-політичних
see
змін
that
і
there were
внаслідок
some
набуття
transformation of
українцями історичної
decommunization
свободи.
due to historic events
Істотним,
and
але
due
не
to the
цілковитий
change of the
розрив
views
із
of
комуністичною
Ukrainians.
ідеологією спричинила анексія Криму і агресія Росії
Crimea
як спадкоємиці
annexation
радянського
and
режиму на
Russian
сході
aggression
України.
in Ukraine
І, зрештою,
caused
негативне ставлення до
the
тисячі
acceleration in the
пам'ятників,
pace
які
of
розташовані були у
decommunization
центрах
and
колишніх сіл України, ця хвиля негативного ставлення
inspired
поширилася
negative
на ці пам'ятники.
attitude towards
Відбулося масове знецінення
this type of
об'єктів культурної
monuments.
спадщини, які десятиліттями до того перебували
The
під захистом
cultural
українського
heritage
законодавства.
landmarks
І,
became
відповідно, схвалення
devaluated
у 2015
by
році і поступове
due
впровадження
to
законів про
these events.
декомунізацію, і в тому числі спричинені ними широкі
The
суспільні
law on
дискусії, підіграли суттєву
decommunization
роль
and
трансформації
heated
уявлень про
debate
культурну спадщину,
in the
створені за
society
СРСР.
transformed
Тут я хочу зазначити, що
considerably
вузьке
the
визначення
perception of the
декомунізації в
cultural
процесі прийняття
heritage.
і впровадження 4 законів, воно було
Here, I would
застосовано
like to
безпосередньо і
mention that
українськими науковцями,
decolonization
наприклад,
was used
Георгієм
in
Касьяновим,
its
або
narrow
зарубіжними
sense,
науковцями, такими як Девід
and
Малпус.
it was also
Воно
used by
обмежує можливості вивчення
Kasyanov or
трансформації
Marx.
суспільних уявлень про
And
минуле і про
in
культурну
my
спадщину,
opinion, it
тобто
is
звужує ці
limiting
можливості вивчення уявлень.
in
Як на
terms
мене,
of
значно
the
аналітично
perception
дальшим
of
є
the
запропонований
history. In
Олександром
my
Гриценком
opinion,
визначення
Alexander
декомунізації в широкому
Hrutsenko's
сенсі.
definition of decommunization is more to the point, since in his opinion, this means the dismantling of the cultural heritage of the Soviet and Russian imperial times. The communization effort also pertains to various landmarks and buildings. At the same time, we have to take it means that we have to take into consideration the views of the views and the perception of specific historic figures that the monuments are dedicated to. This issue of decolonization and its urgency was also stressed by Mykola Repchuk in 2017, and I quote, "It is decolonization that should be the first thing to be discussed in so-called decommunization laws. Communism in Ukraine has always been and still is only a cover for Russian imperial hegemony. It is just part of the simulacra of the Russian world, Slavic unity, and Eurasian integration. That is why in Soviet Ukraine it was virtually impossible to separate communization from Russification, and Russian was perceived as a synonym with Soviet. From the formal point of view, the entire pre-Soviet Russian imperial heritage in Ukraine, from Suvorov and Kutuzov to Stolypin and Denikin, remains outside the jurisdiction of decommunization law. Meanwhile, it is the heritage that is a problem for Ukraine, and it's part of, and it is part of what communist memorials are symbols of Russian imperial domination, and not the struggle of the working class.
I would like to mention that Ukraine built with Soviet concept also included a lot of imperial ideology that oftentimes did not go against the Soviet doctrine, but rather also strengthened its potential, was combined with it. In multiple various elements, you can see the interpretation of different phenomena from the viewpoint of the Russian imperial ideology. Another task which also impacts how we are perceiving the heritage. However, the solution is way more complicated that was imposed by the Soviet concepts. It's what was mentioned by Honcharenko, the need to rethink the heritage of the so-called Ukrainian Soviet culture, in particular that part of it that is considered by inertia to be the classics of Ukrainian literature and art, without adding problems to the fact that it was often imbued with propaganda of the totalitarian Soviet regime and contained gross distortions of the history. In the context of the threats posed by the Russia's large-scale invasion in 2022, this task has not lost its relevance compared to others, as evidenced by the debate over the dismantling of the Soviet coat of arms from the Motherland Monument at the National Museum of the History of Ukraine in World War II. One of the reasons for the ambivalent attitude towards Soviet-era monuments is significant and worth preserving because it is, after all, our history, or a monument created in Ukraine by Ukrainian artists is no condemning communist regime as a criminal one. At the same time, the prohibition of the use of symbols of the communist totalitarian regime in public space by law under communization also shaped the necessary mechanism and accelerated the dismantling of objects containing its propaganda. It also sparked broad public debate on the condemnation of its criminal nature. The debate has also turned to other complex issues, including those at the intersection of Soviet propaganda, whose symbols should be removed, and artistic merit, which is valuable when it comes to cultural self-expression. Support or opposition to the dismantling of our objects with elements of propaganda depended on the criteria used by various public and cultural groups. And the problem of scientific and art historical expertise came up again, explaining to the general public why certain objects should be preserved while others should be dismantled and removed from the symbolic space rather than destroyed. Many experts argued that renaming and dismantling monuments during decommunization is only a superficial change, and that it is necessary to change consciousness. They say the people are used to names of the places, and changing names is a necessary expense and hassle. Monuments seem to have lost their former role. They are not taken into account, and some are outstanding works of art protected by the law. It is true, they are protected by the legislation adopted over 20 years ago, which was amended without providing for the transformation of the ideas inherited from the Soviet Union about the significance of the heritage of the Soviet days, created under the Russian Empire or during the Soviet days. So it was protected by Soviet and later, as a result, Ukrainian legislation. However, without removing communist symbols from the public space, without removing markers of this worldview from the information space, it is impossible to get to a deeper layer, to understand that communist ideology absorbed the basic concepts of Russian colonialism. Naturally, heated discussions about dismantling unfold if the monument is not only propaganda, but also a work of art. Let's take an example. Monument to Shores, erected to mark the 300th anniversary of the Pereyaslav Rada in 1954. It was declared by Tymoshenko government a monument of national importance in 2009. Basically, it was included in the state register. In May 2016, a part of the artist community and the expert council at the Department of Cultural Heritage of the Kyiv City State Administration decided not to put it on the list for dismantling, as it is an architectural monument of national importance. Instead, they suggested to put up a sign which would mention both good and bad things about Shores. According to the law, the monument to Shores was supposed to be dismantled in 2016, but no one was ready to assume responsibility for that, neither the city administration nor the Minister of Culture. Since the monument is of artistic value, they insisted that it should be moved to the Museum of Totalitarianism that was planned to be created, but never was in fact created. At the end of 2016, the dismantling project was finalized, and on March 15, 2017, the Kyiv City Council stated that the decision should be made by the Ministry of Culture or the government. Again, here we're coming back to the national importance of this monument. The delay was provoked by the fact that some activists thought of the leg of the horse, while others attached a plaster leg. In summer 2018, Shores monument was surrounded by banners and the colors of the flag, as you can see in this picture. In 2021, this banner was removed because it was torn by the wind. And in 2022, in summer, a campaign started. And the campaign titled Me Entirely. And it also said, fought against the UPR army. It is noteworthy and that the historical facts about Shores' complicity in the Soviet occupation of Ukraine served as an argument to transform the perception of the monument's value. They outweighed the artistic value and convinced the need to remove it, but not to destroy it. In the end, the law on condemnation and prohibition of propaganda of Russian imperial policy in Ukraine and localization of place names was passed in 2023. And one of the monuments that was supposed to be dismantled was the monument to Shores. And in December 2023, it was finally dismantled, and now it is stored in one of the museums in Kyiv. And there were multiple interesting discussions happening surrounding the subject matter that also reflect what cultural values should be preserved and which should not. Some Ukrainian activists and artists defended the monument from dismantling under slogans like "This is our history," reiterating cliches about both the common past and the outstanding work of art protected by the law. They avoided addressing the fact that beyond its artistic value, this work is also a tool of propaganda and that should be removed from the public space in a civilized manner, while still preserving it for art historical analysis. Critics of the dismantling argued that such a memory policy breeds division and conflicts. I would like to mention that rethinking established collective narratives about the past, historical events, and prominent figures is inherently conflict-generating. The deconstruction of stereotypes inevitably causes dissatisfaction among certain segments of society. And not doing that leads to the other segment of society not being happy. And the question here is, who supports which approach and what policy? Does that mean that the symbols that were created under pressure, where there was colonial propaganda, should not be reconsidered and rethought? If this leads to more conflict and deepens the conflict, does the government's inaction or resistance to public demands for change only deepen conflicts and provoke a practical rethinking of space, as seen with events like the Lenin Falls in Ukraine in 1991 and 2013? This question should not only be raised about monuments to Lenin, which few mourn today, or the already dismantled statues of Shors and Pushkin, whose continued honoring remains a point of contention for some of the Ukrainian population, but also the debated fate of the museums that are actively discussed. For example, Bulgakov Museum in Kiev or Poltava Battlefield in Poltava and many other similar cases. Observing the ongoing debates around the preservation and removal of monuments, it becomes evident that the interpretations of historical events or figures imposed by empires are often seen by many as the accepted norm. Conversely, attempts to analyze these interpretations, or even more so to reject them, are perceived by defenders of colonial symbols as deviations from the norm. When discussing figures like Mazeppa, Petlura, or Bandera, presenting them just as an example because probably there is the most controversy around them, basically informing about them as such by providing facts, not only repeating manipulation or negative evaluation, is interpreted as heroization. So basically, if the author of a textbook is not calling these people traitors, criminals, collaborators, but rather describes their life in the historical context with all the facts and evaluations, be it positive or negative ones, they risk to be proclaimed being biased, radicalized, nationalized, etc. However, trying to change the canon of the heroes that were imposed by the propaganda from the empire that can be seen in multiple names of places, monuments, were called radicalization, politicization, nationalization, which causes division within society in this way. And a discourse distortion of both the content and form of decolonization and decolonization has been occurring. The analysis and rejection of false narratives about figures with Ukrainian identity is labeled heroization, while a critical stance towards figures loyal to empires, be it Russian or communist empire, is dismissed as radicalization or distortion of the true past. I propose a set of questions for evaluating monuments and other cultural heritage sites created under the communist totalitarian regime recognized as criminal and Russian imperial colonial policy in accordance with Ukrainian decommunization and decolonization legislation. When was the monument created? Who created the monument? On whose initiative was it created and under what circumstances? What historical events of local, regional, national, or supranational history are reflected? Which event, person, or cultural phenomenon does the monument glorify? Who placed the monument in public space, and where is it located, in the center or in the periphery? Now, given the new knowledge, the collapse of the empire, new statehood, has the attitude towards the events or individuals honored by the monument evolved or changed? What original names are engraved on the monument? What social ideas or political views does it reflect? And to what extent can this monument be used to further promote colonial concept? How much is it associated with the past traumatic experience of particularly when it comes to colonial practices applied to local communities, ethnic, religious, or linguistic? The answers to these questions are closely tied to the criteria used to determine what should be preserved and what should be dismantled. The list of criteria proposed by different actors and groups is generally similar, encompassing historical, legislative, artistic, economic, political, and security aspects. However, the hierarchy varies depending on certain criteria in the modern context. And on the one hand, this heated debate about the heritage is the strength of Ukrainian society. On the other hand, Russians view the presence of colonial concepts embodied in cultural heritage objects as proof of the region's and its people connection to the Russian world. So basically, they believe that it is necessary to liberate those they consider compatriots, regardless of the local population's wishes. Therefore, the removal of elements that promote colonial concepts is not merely a matter of historical or artistic analysis for us. It is also essential for preserving national identity and, by extension, the nation. After February 2022, many question whether it is necessary to preserve the memory of that part of Ukraine's history and culture whose markers are Russian and Soviet street names, monuments, and museums. On one hand, these elements are part of Ukraine's heritage. On the other hand, they're a result of a deliberate policy to impose colonial concepts about the common past, fraternal peoples, and everything that happened over a century ago and continued throughout the 30 years of Ukrainian independence. And to finalize, I would like to say that we need to work on analytically separating three types of objects or elements of cultural heritage. First, objects and elements that should be preserved in public space because their Ukrainian-centric meanings and artistic value are dominant. Second, cultural property that should remain in public space, but only after their symbolic message has been reinterpreted and redefined, strengthening Ukrainian identity and diminishing Russian and Soviet symbolism. And the third one, cultural property that should be dismantled regardless of their artistic or historical value, if they serve as monumental propaganda that cannot be rethought or redefined, as they glorify the defeat of Ukrainians and Ukrainian statehood while promoting the rejection of Ukrainian identity in favor of the Russian one. And to finalize, I would like to mention this quote, which I basically read yesterday. I received the issue of the Slavic Review, and it had a very nice article about everything about the poetry during the genocidal war, where he quotes a poem that also has an amazing translation in English. And if we think that, well, not only our shelves should be filled with hardcover books, but our streets should also be filled with the names of our poets, then we have to think about how can we remove the names of other poets that have been filling our streets for years and years. Thank you. Thank you so much, Nadia. Thank you for such an excellent presentation. I believe we're going to have a very lively discussion following it. Ladies and gentlemen, please chime in. Please participate in discussion. Any comments, opinions, questions to Nadia? Go ahead, the floor is yours. Natalia, over to you. Good evening, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Nadia, thank you so very much for such an unbelievable presentation. There are so many things that I was thinking about while you were presenting, but I would like to only ask one question to not take up too much of your time. The question regarding your final remarks, where you were suggesting the separation into different groups, 3 groups of cultural property that we should deal with. And the second group specifically caught my attention. Those objects and elements that should stay within our space, but the ones that need to be rethought or redefined. So I basically have the following question. I understand really well what you're talking about, but a practical question. How do you envision that? Are there any examples of such memorials that were reconsidered, ratified after February 24th, 2022? So this is the first part of my question. And the second part of my question is, let's assume that we are rethinking, redefining this cultural property. But what about those people that exist in the same environment with this monument? Say there was some public discussion, and following that, are they gonna view it from a different perspective? How is it gonna change the perception within the community? Will they still keep perceiving it the same way that they used to, or will their perception change too? Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia, for your questions. They are rather difficult, but I would resort to Jake McLean's strategy when asked hard questions. Well, I will not try to pretend that I have the full answer to your question. Your question is a hard one. It is true, we have a lot of work ahead of us, and yet I believe that we may resort to the example of the coat of arms, the Soviet coat of arms that was dismantled from the motherland monument. We have heard a lot of debates regarding that. There were supporters and there were protesters, and there were various arguments on both sides. Notably, the arguments were sensible from both sides. It seems to me that if we are able to render landmark some Ukrainian flavor, if we can shift the focus into the Ukrainian identity domain, then it is widely supported by the society, and that is the approach that we should follow. Of course, for many people, the symbolism of a particular landmark will remain the same, but for some, they will not have the background perception of it, and they will perceive it completely different. For instance, the monument to Lenin that was taken down in 2013. Now, this is the place where the performances uh, taken, are made. And for the modern day students, for younger generation, that place is not associated with the monument to Lenin. With time, we may think whether we should install a different monument over there or not. Of course, for some time, some new generation will have a completely different perception of that place. They will have different associations with that place. But of course, it doesn't mean that we can overlook the analysis part. It is all part of our worldview and identity preservation concepts. Earlier today, I read an article about the reluctance to the change of geographical names in Poland. as Polish citizens were against the change of the names of the streets that were named after the figures of the communist regime. They were protesting against that in 2016. It means that the habit got hold of them, and it means that the historical significance of the name of the street matters less than their comfort in everyday life. It means that in our daily lives we have a lot of monuments and we have a lot of landmarks surrounding us that are part of our comfort zone. Do we want them to be part of the habit, or do we want to change the views? Thank you very much, and thank you very much for your last comment on the habits and on the customs, on the things that we are used to versus the historic significance. Yes, right, you are. And the way of being comfortable usually is predominant when it comes to ordinary people. They do not care that much about historical significance. For instance, we know that the situation with the new calendar also caused a lot of debates and some reluctance. Thank you, Nadia. Thank you, Natalia. While you were thinking about your next questions, I have one. My question is related to the question of Natalia. You have suggested a list of questions, and you also mentioned criteria for dismantling landmarks in the public space. Are there any institutions drafting those criteria? Who is behind this work? And my next question is related to the first one. Who are actually the actors behind these processes? Who are the parties that are actually taking down the monuments? Is it up to some civic activists, initiatives? Or are there any organizations that specialize in dismantling monuments, for instance? Thank you for your questions. Regarding the first one, criteria, there are many publications and discussions regarding this criteria, and we hear different opinions in those articles and publications. Apart from that, there is an expert council comprised of academia, and this is the council that works at the Ukrainian Institute of the National Memory. But at the same time, the Institute of the National Memory doesn't want to impose its opinion, and we don't want to be perceived as the party that has the final say. No, this council is comprised of the scholars and historians from various educational institutions in Ukraine. They analyze examples of, they analyze the cases that cause debates in society, and they offer their recommendations. This expert council does not have the power to demand anything of anyone. They only give their recommendations. In its turn, the Institute of National Memory also offers its recommendations to the local governments. When the local governments try to abide by the law on decommunization passed in 2023. The various actors behind this process, there are many actors, yes, indeed. For instance, the case of Bulgakov's museum in Kiev. The expert council, in its recommendations, offered a number of reasons why this museum does not function at the expense of the budget of the city of Kiev, and why Bulgakov should not be honored in Ukrainian literature. At the same time, there was resistance, and there were counter arguments to these recommendations. And actually, the expert council had to change their conclusions regarding the Bulgakov's figure. The debates are not over yet. The museum is still up and running, and I believe that we will see more discussions around it. Regarding the geographical names, the local governments and communities come to the fore in this case. I participated in the process of changing one of the geographical names, the city Vatutin of Cherkasy region, that is called Bagacheva now. The the local citizens collected signatures for their community to be renamed, but other citizens were against it. We seeked the expert review from the National History Institute of Ukraine, and we received the expert reviews. We offered those expert reviews to the local citizens. We collected the signatures, but some citizens were against renaming the settlement, and there were even uh, hearings, court hearings about this renaming of the community. This decision on renaming the community was brought to the highest level, to the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine. In this process, local citizens were engaged, and they learned a lot about Vatutin and his impact on Ukraine's history. The whole process took a year and a half, but I believe that this is a positive example in which the citizens were able to learn more about their local history, especially when it pertains to the historic geographical names. On one hand, it is good to have many stakeholders, and on the other hand, it results in certain delays with the final decision being passed. But I believe that it is still a good sign, because this decision was not brought from the top to the bottom. No, this decision was the collegial decision from the community. Thank you, Nadia, for your response. Dear colleagues, do you have any other questions? Nadia, my next question pertains to the to your deliberations on the impact of Russification and its connection to decolonization. You mentioned the law of 2023. The law of 2023 does not give a definition of Russification. It mentions the notion of de-Russification, but we do not have any definition of Russification. What is the link between derussification process and decolonization process? Could you elaborate on that? What is the future of these processes, in your opinion? Well, in my opinion, this process of derussification, if it is not clearly defined in the law, it doesn't mean that it does not exist. This process started a long time ago, and I believe that it started after 2015. It was backed by the law on quotas on Ukrainian content on the television and on the radio. These laws on quotas for Ukrainian content on Ukrainian television and on Ukrainian radio were not interpreted as the laws on derussification, but it was an actual derussification, since we know that Ukrainian media environment was highly saturated with the Russian language, even though those products were of Ukrainian manufacturing, of Ukrainian origin. And the argument here was that those authors of that content were Ukrainians and the taxpayers in Ukraine, which caused some distortion of what was offered. And we were not able to have Ukrainian content in Ukrainian media. Some part of Ukrainian society was simply stripped of the opportunity to listen to the Ukrainian content. That was a practical step towards diversification. If we take diversification in the sense of the law of 2023, then it is more about the geographical names being changed, the geographical names that pertain to the Russian heritage, the geographical names that pertain to the Russian culture, that were rather popular in Ukraine for quite some time. I know that we will have a lot of discussions around these issues in the future, and we still have a lot of work ahead of us. Thank you, Nadia. Yulia, please go ahead. Good evening. Good afternoon. I have a quick question. Probably you gave the answer to this one earlier, but still, I was wondering, do you know any examples of social surveys among the citizens, public surveys about the citizens? Maybe there could be some opinion polls held that would help in this process of decommunization. Are there any cases of this opinion polls actually been taken? Thank you for your question. Yes, indeed, there are discussions ongoing, but time flies, and since 2022, our life is so intense and eventful that I sometimes lose track of the time. There were discussions and there were votings about over 100 geographical names. I think it was 2023. Some civil society organizations offered the list of streets to be renamed, and the citizens were offering some names of the Ukrainian historical figures, which should be used instead. Historians at that time were offering a lot of historical figures from early modern times of Ukraine. And these people were unknown in terms of their names have been part of the geographical names were used as the place names since they pertain to um, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth times. Here, a number of interesting names were offered. For instance, we had the Ostrowski Prince was added as a place name, and well, it's just from the top of my head, but many of these decisions were passed thanks to the proposals that were offered at the grassroots level. Sometimes we may have doubts about the representatives and the representation of the citizens, but people can take a part in this process. Sometimes the citizens do not want to take part in discussions, but when the decision is passed, some start protesting. But here, I would like to ask those citizens why they were not participating from the very beginning. Therefore, it is up to us to be consistent, to pay attention, and to take part in the process of the discussion of the names of the streets, for instance. I believe that these opinion polls or surveys, they are crucially important to have consensus in the cases of changing the geographic names. Thank you. Thank you very much, Nadia. Unfortunately, our time is up. Thank you very much for the topic of your presentation. It was highly relevant and fascinating. I would like to thank our presenters. Your presentations were completely different, but still they were united by the idea of the preservation of Ukrainian identity. And I would like to thank our speakers for presenting their inputs. Dear colleagues, I would like to remind you that this Thursday, we will meet again for another seminar. We will have two more presentations um, the, about Zmyiny Island, and we will also have the presentation by Lisa Daniluk, and it will be dedicated to the environmental law. I would like to thank the universities that got on board with our initiative, and I would like to thank our colleagues from Big Ten universities who assisted us in providing financial resources to our scholars. Thank you very much. Looking forward to our following seminars. Stay safe and glory to Ukraine. Glory to heroes. And we would like to thank our interpreters, Yana and Anastasia. Thank you. Thank you. Bye.